Okay, let's get rolling with the pre-midterm review lecture. Office hours today are going to be after lecture, 12:30 to 2 p.m. in the Free Speech Movement Cafe, which means almost always on the rather chilly and perhaps somewhat wet patio outside, since one consequence of the rise of the laptop over the past decade has been many, many more people sitting in the FSM Cafe with their laptops, taking up lots and lots of space for lots and lots of time, and the university has not quadrupled the seating in cafes that would be needed to deal with this change in human behavior. We've seen since the year 2000, in fact. Now, there'll be no office hours on Wednesday. There were office hours on Monday and last Friday, because I'm about to go, after office hours, to the airport for one of my 2 midweek trips this semester that I did not want to wriggle out of once it became clear that I was teaching this course. I'm going to Ottawa to talk to Canadians about their macroeconomic policy options, which I must say look pretty bleak. That is, Ontario, Canada's major province, both in terms of employment and manufacturing and population, Ontario is married or more than married to the American Midwest. And so slow recovery in the American Midwest means a lack of demand for what Ontario makes. The only potential wiggle room is provided by the Canadian exchange rate, the value of the Canadian dollar. But even if the American Midwest is not booming, if Canada manages to depress the value of the Canadian dollar enough to make the products of Ontario seem like real bargains to people in the Midwest, then Canada can still get an economic boom, can decouple itself from the American Midwest. The problem is that even though the North Atlantic is recovering very, very slowly from the downturn, developing Asia is recovering very, very rapidly. And rapid recovery in developing Asia means a very strong demand for natural resources, especially oil, because developing Asia appears to be following a uniquely resource-intensive development path, unique in world history, which means that oil prices are likely to be high in the future, which is great news for the oil exporters of Western Canada. It's great news for Alberta. But strong oil exports tend to push up the value of the Canadian dollar, and what's good for Alberta is not good for Ontario. And Canada has not been as good as the United States, although it's a lot better than the European Union, in finding mechanisms for risk and burden sharing across its provinces. That's what I'm going to be doing while you're here taking your exam. Good luck. There will be post-exam office hours on Friday in Evans 601 from 1:30 to 3 p.m. for anyone who wants to come and talk about what they ought to have done on the exam. But I never like doing that. Some undergraduates do, most don't. Our commercial, last Friday, we had our second kind of Blum Center Political Economy Colloquium, which I at least thought was very interesting. We got to see Alan Karras, for whom I have the utmost admiration, talk about his view on the shape of world history, and also Mark Healy, chairman of the Latin American Studies major. The next one we're going to have is supposed to be starring Dariush, and it was tentatively scheduled for March 18th until someone smarter than me pointed out to me that that's the day before spring vacation, and so we guarantee 0 attendance if we have it on March 18th. So we're going to be pushing the next one back a couple of weeks. Whatever, it's a beautiful building. The Blum Center provides food. This past Friday, they provided not just healthy vegetables and semi-healthy but very good cheese, but they also provided lots of refined sugar in the form of large numbers of cookies. A good time was held by all, and do come. That is one... I oscillate between thinking there are many things wrong with Berkeley and thinking that it's practically perfect in every way. But in either of those, one thing that could be improved is engagement by undergraduates with the intellectual life of the campus outside their classes. Too many undergraduates seem to spend all of their time within, say, 200 feet, 300 feet of, say, their gate, and don't venture out and see what's going on in the rest of the university, and it is very interesting. So with that, now let's turn to problem set 6, the sample midterm. That's due now. Due now right up here. Write your section time on the front. The sample midterm had 3 components. It had one-sentence identifications. It had problems like those on the other problem sets, and it had short answers, a paragraph or 2. It had no essays, no big essays, which are traditional in history or English courses. It had no essays because it's much easier to read a bunch of short answer paragraphs than to read and grade a single long essay. And also, the deans are putting pressure on us to change how we evaluate your writing, on the grounds that term papers and long exam essays are a kind of artificial form of prose expression that we don't really see very much, very often, once you leave the university. That is, a bunch of people in the future, pretty much whatever your job is, whatever you're doing, are going to ask you to write 1, 2, or 3 paragraphs summarizing X. Or they may ask you to write something very long and comprehensive, a 100-page argument or so. The things in the middle, the kind of write frantically for 2 hours all you know about a particular subject, or the 10 to 15-page term paper, those really don't exist outside the university. It's a question of whether they ever really existed outside the university. Nowadays, they don't. We should be shifting the writing we expect you to do over to forms of writing that it will be valuable to you in the future to actually get good at. The sample midterm differs from the actual midterm in that the economic growth stuff in the course, weeks 2 through 4 of my lectures and chapters 4 and 5 in the textbook, have been pushed off to the early April midterm, for which you have Dariush to thank, who pointed out that as I conceptualized the midterm, it was undoable in an hour and 20 minutes, and that wasn't fair. And so there'll be choice on the midterm, which he also said wasn't quite fair. And the midterm will focus on the national income accounting parts, the depression economics parts, and a little bit on the overview of macroeconomics. Figure it covers chapters 1 through 11, with chapter 7 largely excluded and with barely a hint of chapter 12. We'll do chapter 12 in detail after the midterm. Otherwise, it covers the textbook chapters 1 through 11 and the first 15 chapters of the Nosera and McLean book. All the devils are here. And to warm up, there are kind of 2 equations that figuring out how to use them is going to be key to success on the problem parts of the midterm. And the first is the simple income expenditure equation. Figuring out what the level of real GDP in an economy is if you know the components of autonomous spending, that is all the pieces of spending that do not depend on income, exports to foreigners, government purchases, investment spending by businesses, and that portion of consumption spending that depends on consumer confidence and not on kind of consumers' incomes. Use that and the parameters of the multiplier, and you will hopefully get the right answer. And here the right answer is, I think it's 17.5 trillion. Let's see if you agree. No, not too many of you do agree. Yeah, it's 17.5 trillion, right? That you have 1 minus 0.8 from 1 minus the tax rate times 1.0, that gives you 0.2. 0.2 plus 0.2 is 0.4, that gives you a multiplier of 2.5, since you have a 0.4 in the denominator. Add up 2, 4, 6, and 7, and you have 7 times 2.5, and that gives you 17.5 trillion. Moving on to the alternative formulation, the one that we owe to John Hicks back in 1937, the investment savings formulation of the income expenditure model, which we like because it divides the determinants of real GDP and its changes into 4 components. The things that affect the multiplier down here on the bottom, government fiscal policy right here, financial markets plus monetary policy here, and other stuff having to do with confidence in what foreigners are doing here. And those 4 sets of factors are pretty much independent. Not totally independent, but largely independent. It makes sense to ask what will be the consequences of having the Federal Reserve change interest rates on the economy. There you just have to move this R term. While if you were looking at the regular income expenditure equation, you would then have to say, well, gee, that will change investment, and that'll change exports, and that'll change consumption as well. It's complicated. This makes it significantly less complicated. So here we're asking you, what's the multiplier? Well, the multiplier is 1 minus 0.75 times 1, that's 0.25, plus this 0.08333 term that gets us up to 0.33 in the denominator. The inverse of 0.33, the multiplicative inverse of 0.33 is 3. We got a multiplier of 3. Let's see about E. Still not doing too well. Okay, so next time, even more time. Let's boost all the way up to a minute. We got the same multiplier as before. We have a sensitivity of investment spending to the interest rate of 15, a sensitivity of exports to the exchange rate of 0.5, a sensitivity of the exchange rate to the interest rate of 10. And what's going on in the Federal Reserve and financial markets is raising long-term risky real interest rates R by 3%, which I used to say was a very big number, that we're unlikely to have such a large jump in interest rates in any relatively short period here in America. It just doesn't happen. Then came the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, during which this long-term real risky interest rate jumped by what looks like 10 full percentage points, by 3 times this amount, which is the reason that we're now in this particular big pickle that we happen to be. And 2 more. All right, people are happy with D. Is D going to be right? It looks like it. We have a sensitivity of autonomous spending to the interest rate of 15 plus 10 times 0.5 of 20. We have a 3 percentage point rise in the interest rate, so that's 20 times 0.03. That will give us 0.6. We have a multiplier of 1.8. Since interest rates are rising, real GDP is falling. So we have a multiplier of 3, and 3 times 0.6 is 1.8. Since interest rates are rising, GDP is falling. It is indeed D, and we're now up to a clear plurality. Getting full credit on the problems on the midterm will depend on your being able to do perform this type of calculation, and then surround it with words and do the right calculations. Do the calculations appropriate to the problem you're given, and not to do them in a minute. You'll have about 3 minutes or so for each problem like this, rather than the 30 seconds to 70 seconds that I've given you. So it's going to be easier, but nailing this is going to be important. But the midterm is going to start out with identifications. In general, to study for the identifications part of the midterm, I think the best thing to do is to read Marty Olney and my textbook and look at the concepts that we thought were important back when we wrote the textbook, because we really haven't changed our mind, except very much at the margins. And you can nail this if you're asked what GDP is, if you're able to say that GDP stands for real gross domestic product, and is the inflation-adjusted value of all the marketed goods and services produced in a year. If, when we ask what the income expenditure equation is, ideally, I suppose you want to write it down. And let's see if we could do this. You want to write down that Y is then equal to the 4 components of autonomous spending: baseline confidence-driven consumption spending, business investment spending, government purchases, and gross exports, divided by these multiplier terms. We see Y plus IMY, and we'll fix up the subscripts later. This is an equation that tells you what the economy's short-run equilibrium level of GDP is going to be as a function of the behavioral parameters that determine the multiplier, right? How the government taxes increases in income, how consumers respond by changing their spending in response to changes in after-tax income, and how the economy responds by raising investments or by raising import spending when total income and production rise. Those 3 behavioral parameters that determine the multiplier, plus the function of the 4 components of autonomous spending. Do that, and you nail that question. Then subprime mortgages. Well, the mortgages that first went bad in the financial crisis. Extremely risky loans to low-quality buyers purchasing overpriced houses. But the interesting thing about subprime mortgages in the 2000s, for the purpose of this course, is that investment banks claimed that securities that were built on top of these subprime mortgages, that even though each individual mortgage was risky, and even though all the mortgages in one particular city, Las Vegas, Merced, Fresno, Riverside, were risky, they claimed that they had managed to turn them into safe assets via the alchemy of derivative-based securities and diversification. That's what the investment banks claimed. The investment banks claimed wrong. They probably sincerely believed it, or at least they acted as though they sincerely believed it, because they wound up holding an awful lot of these things when the economy went south. It wasn't very much that they were trying to deceive the people who bought the mortgage-backed securities from them, based on subprime mortgages from them, or at least they did as good a job of deceiving themselves as they did of deceiving their potential customers. Those are the 3 of the identifications that we put on problem set 6. 3 more, straight out of the textbook, except possibly for the last one, where we've rephrased it a little bit, to focus on how risky the important real interest rate is. But the unemployment rate is the share of the labor force, those with jobs plus those looking for work, who do not have jobs and who are looking for work. The unemployment rate is a very imperfect measure of, say, the total number of people who would like to have jobs who really don't have them, or don't have the jobs they want, or don't have the jobs they qualify for. The bare unemployment rate doesn't include people who want full-time jobs but can only find part-time jobs. The unemployment rate doesn't include people who have dropped out of the labor force because they think the labor market is lousy and they have a very hard time finding a job if they looked. Attempts to correct this by looking at other questions on the current population survey have not been terribly successful. That is, you can ask someone, are you a discouraged worker? And even if they are a discouraged worker, even if you know fracking well that if the economy were stronger and jobs were easier to find, that they'd be in the labor market looking for a job and finding one. If you ask most discouraged workers in the economy, are you a discouraged worker? Most of them will say no. I'm getting my head together, or I'm writing my novel, or I'm going to school, or I'm staying home with the kids. I'm really not someone who has just dropped out of the labor force out of despair because there are no jobs out there. But it's nevertheless the case that they would be in the labor force and they would be employed if the unemployment rate were lower. You've seen this over the past year. Over the past year, the unemployment rate has gone down from 10% of the labor force to 9% of the labor force, even though the share of adults at work has not changed. Measured as the fraction of adults who are at work, the economy is providing no more jobs now than it was a year ago, but the unemployment rate is down by a full percentage point because about 0.7, an extra 0.7% of adults in America have simply said, I'm no longer looking for a job. And if you ask that 0.7%, are you discouraged workers, only about a seventh of them will say that they are. You ask the others, well, why aren't you looking for a job now? You were looking for a job last year at this time. And if you conducted a very detailed interview, eventually they may say, well, this other option is what I'm really doing, and it looked a lot better because there were no jobs out there. Maybe I am a discouraged worker. Maybe not. But it would take a long, deep social psychology or social welfare interview rather than a short economics check the box on this form as the interview comes by to detect those people. The inflation rate, the rate at which average prices in the economy are changing. We want the inflation rate to be low because if the inflation rate is high, two things happen. First, prices no longer act as very good signals for telling people what's cheap and what's expensive because people lose the anchor about what something ought to cost in their minds. Second, people who ought to be focusing on how to make production more efficient instead focus on how to game the process of inflation to become rich. And so you get a large diversion of energy and effort away from the positive sum game of increasing productivity to the zero sum game of figuring out how you can profit and make someone else lose, right, from inflation. The long-term real risky interest rate, that's how much non-blue chip businesses have to pay in order to obtain capital to expand or continue normal operations, adjusted for expected inflation. That's the interest rate that really matters for production and demand and employment. The level of value of the currency, the level of exports, the level of business investment spending are all very powerfully affected by and responsive to, right, this particular interest rate. This is the one that you want to watch. And this is the one that when it went sky high in late 2008 led all us economists to kind of turn white with fear. More identifications. On the midterm, we asked about the investment savings curve, which was the graphical representation you use when you want to think graphically about the investment savings equation. It has the level of GDP on the horizontal axis and the long-term risky real interest rate on the vertical axis. It's a downward sloping curve showing that when you cut the long-term real risky interest rate, productions going to demand and incomes are going to go up. It's a very convenient and easy tool to use if you naturally think in terms of analytic geometry, as opposed to algebra or as opposed, right, to words. In most intermediate macro classes, when you ask problems on the midterm and the final, you're going to be asked to draw the investment savings curve on a graph as well as solve the problem. It's not clear to me that's a good pedagogical strategy to follow because for a lot of people the graph simply isn't helpful. On the other hand, if ever I'm doing a problem, I'm one of the people who finds it useful to draw the graph and try to figure out where the IS curve is before I then proceed to the algebra. Do whatever feels right to you in terms of maximizing your productivity. We already talked about the investment savings equation, the version of the income expenditure model that divides the determinants of the level of the change in real GDP up in a way that's convenient for policy. And we already talked about the marginal propensity to consume, this little CY parameter in the multiplier denominator in the income expenditure model, the share of an increase or decrease in after-tax incomes that shows up as an increase or decrease in consumption spending. And the last identifications are straight out of lecture, are some of the key numbers that I want you to keep in your heads. I'm not going to ask you about the 1,700-fold increase in total world real GDP since 8000 BC. Although I was present at a dean's meeting yesterday where it was discussed, and where I tried to make a push that everyone, before they graduate from Berkeley, should have to make their own flint hand axe out of flint, which no one else seemed to like except for an anthropologist or two. Seemed to think this would be a key graduation requirement. So how many people, I will ask for other things having to do with business cycles and depression economics. Other key numbers I tried to push into your heads. What's the unemployment rate right now? It's 9%. About how many people lose or quit their jobs in an average month? About 4 million. Yep.
Is that because the notes it was 5 million?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, we're going to be asking just orders of magnitude. Right? Get it more than half, get it less than double of what the average over whatever period I take is. It's a question as to whether you should do it as a rate or a number. 4 million makes it sound like really, really huge. Say that it's 3% of workers in a month. That doesn't sound so huge, but then you add that up over the course of a year and kind of adjusting for the fact that some people change jobs more than once over the course of the year, that 30% of Americans change jobs every year is quite remarkable. Are hired or are fired or are quit and find another job. That's a quite remarkable amount of mobility. The fact that the average job you've had is about 3 years long. You see the jobs I've had since I graduated from graduate school. Well, you see, I spent 1 year as a lecturer at MIT so they could decide not to hire me. It was a wonderful year. In some ways, it's the best year of my life, even though they were deciding not to hire me. There were 3 years spent at Boston University. There were then 3 years spent at Harvard. There were then 3 years spent at the Treasury. And then since 1995, there have been 15 years spent at Berkeley. So I guess 3 years isn't even too bad a measure when it comes to me. And I'm in an industry that's notorious for long job attachment and great security of employment. Right? It's one thing that we professors bargain away perhaps 25% of our normal market income for the fact that you don't always have to be thinking once you get tenure of, gee, who is going to be paying me 3 years from now? And even so, 3, 6, 9, 10, 15, over 25 years at work, 5 jobs, an average of 5, a median of 3, a mode of 3. I'm not that out of line. And how many people are unemployed in an average month? In a normal month, 7 million or so in an average month. Right now, more like 11 million. Got to go back through your notes and take a look.